Okay, we're going to get started for the second lightning round session. I hope you'll enjoy this additional series of quick rapid-fire presentations so we can learn the most about institutional corruption. So I'll give it up to you.
Thank you very much. Hello, my name is Kahn. And I have a day job. I run the data team at Paperless Post, which is a New York startup. And we have startup hours. That means we start a little bit late. And my wife has a normal job. So every morning I spend a bit of time working on trying to take government data and do interesting things with it. So I've built actually the world's most powerful tool to explore who gives money to federal politicians. And this is the first time I'm doing a live demo of it. So here we go. I have over 25 years worth of campaign finance data with over 24,000 federal politicians. And so I'm just going to look up right now my local congressman, Joseph Crowley, in New York District 14. And what you can do in this tool is you can see exactly how much money he's raised every single election cycle and exactly who he's raised it from. So you can see the different sectors are here. You can see finance, insurance, real estate, labor, miscellaneous business, and the legend on the right updates for each election cycle. You can split this data into individual donations, PAC donations, or combine them. You can see this data in total or on a percentage basis. And again, you get this for all 24,000 politicians. Beyond that, you can take these big industries like finance, insurance, real estate, and see them in their sub-industries. So you can split that into securities and investments, insurance, real estate, etc. Every single item on the right here is clickable. And then you can see the companies and PACs that make up those donations. So within finance, insurance, real estate, you can see Guardian Life Insurance gave him $18,000, Blackstone Group here in 2008, Blackstone Group. And then in 2006, I noticed there was no Blackstone Group here. And so beyond that, and at the final level of this visualization, you can actually dig into very raw data down here, all the way down to the individual contributors from that company. And in his case, what you'll see is that one couple from Blackstone kind of gave him a little bit of money back in the 2004 and 2002 election cycle. And then in 2008, 14 people on the exact same day gave him the exact same amount and catapulted from contributing nothing to becoming his largest single contributor. And so you get all of this data for 24,000 federal politicians. This is the kind of thing that journalists and voters and other people really need. And the data has been out there, but there have been no tools that let them take that data and use it effectively. So I'm very excited about this. Beyond this, and actually the thing that I'm most excited about this project is what we're going to do is we're going to put up a forum so that people browsing the site can submit all of the interesting things that they see. And so we can get pretty specific into like a URL and like that Blackstone example. And what this is going to do, it's going to allow us to crowdsource 25 years worth of campaign finance research, so that whenever any citizen or whenever any journalist goes to this page, all of the interesting things that people have ever found about that politician come up to the top. Yeah. Thank you. This project is going to be completely open source, which means that either your states or people in other countries can take this framework and stick it on top of their data, and this can be a real tool that benefits the world beyond just federal politicians in the United States. And I'm happy to announce, so today I just launched a Kickstarter to raise a very small amount of money for this, to have someone work with journalists to help them understand how to use this tool and to help them understand exactly what they can do with it and how they would be able to do it. It will be opening it to the public within a month or two. If any journalists or people here are interested in checking it out, please find me. Thank you very much.
Great, thanks. I'm Frank Dobbin. I'm a residential fellow this year at the Safra Center. I'm also in the Sociology department, just down the road at Harvard most of the time. I've been looking at the corruption of the American meritocracy in corporations. So I want to say something about change in the composition of management in leading and middle-sized US corporations over time, and then tell you why there hasn't been more change and what corporations could be doing about it to alter this. What we have here is, this is all private sector organizations with at least 100 employees over time. And if you look at the orange line, well, it looks so orange there, the black men line. What you see is, in 1983, of all the black men who worked for medium and large corporations in America, in 1983, 6% of them were in management. If you follow that line across, in 2011, 6% of them were in management. If you look at Hispanic men, 7% in 1983, and in 2011, 6.5% of the black men, or the Hispanic men who work for these large corporations were in management. Hispanic women and black women do scarcely better in the last generation. There's been scarcely more change. And white women have almost not changed position at all since 1999. So why is this? Well, one of the reasons is that our ideas about how to create a meritocracy are wrong, but we could change that. We could change that by changing how companies run their hiring and promotion systems and how they treat the issue of diversity. So I want to leave you with just 2 points. 1, what companies are doing wrong, and 2, what companies could do right. What companies are doing wrong is that they're trying to control managerial bias as a solution to creating a meritocracy. We know from decades of research in sociology, psychology, and management that controlling people with rules leads them to try to sabotage the rules, to try to assert their own control. So if you look at these 3 interventions, this is what happens to a firm, to the management of a firm, to the diversity of management of a firm, about 5 years after you put in a reform that's designed to promote diversity, promote opportunity. The first is job tests. The idea there is that if you put in job tests for all managerial positions and make them mandatory, then the hiring managers can't discriminate. They have to hire the people who do best on the test. What you see in the first bar on the left is that when companies put in job tests, about 5 years later, they have 10% fewer women in management than they had before they put in the job tests, fewer white women in management. And if you look across the groups, there are fewer members of each of these groups in management than they would have had if they hadn't put in these job tests. And we see a similar pattern for civil rights grievance procedures and a negative effect on white women for performance evaluations. We see these negative effects because it's a bad idea to try to control managerial bias with rules. It's also a bad idea to try to control managerial thought processes. It doesn't backfire in the same way, but diversity training is the thing that companies spend most on to try to open opportunity. And what we see here is that it does not work. We also see that diversity performance evaluations for managers don't work. Companies could be doing things, however, that would actually open opportunity. And the main thing they can do is they could try to engage managers themselves in making change. One way to engage managers in making change is to make them mentors of women and minorities, so they're responsible for somebody. Another way is to put them on a diversity committee so that they're responsible for institutional change. Another way is to put them in charge of recruitment programs and send them out to colleges and universities to find women and minorities to hire. The problem with the system we have now is that most companies do the bad things, and most companies don't do the good things. This is the percent of companies with performance evaluations, grievance procedures, and job tests, which backfire, compared to the percent who recruit women to training programs and who recruit women at colleges. Companies are doing all the wrong things. Here's diversity training and diversity evaluations versus mentor programs, diversity task forces, and diversity managers. Again, companies are doing the wrong things. Thanks.
Hi, my name is Yuval Feldman. I'm from the Faculty of Law in Bar-Ilan University. This is a joint project funded by the Safra Center with Miriam Korchaki from Kellogg's and Francesca Gino from Harvard Business School. And the topic is expressive effects of corporate ethical codes. I kind of try to go fast on the theoretical slides, but basically there's a lot of debates in literature whether ethical codes even matter, and some studies show there are effects, some studies show they're not, but overall they're still kind of the center of much of the ethics policy in many companies and organizations. And we kind of analyze the text of many of the Fortune 100 codes, and we find that more or less they kind of deal with the same issues. The main variation is kind of the language, specificity, and whether kind of how much employees actually exposed to the codes, and we focus on the language. The importance of language in both in the kind of management, scholarship, and the legal one is huge, and kind of within the law, the notion of the expressive function of the law, so kind of how the law affects beyond just the instrumental kind of information being communicated in the law is a very kind of big literature, and it was recently a book by McAdams kind of summarizing all the literature on that, and this is what we focus here in the context of ethical codes. So just kind of a demonstration, and one of the things we noticed was kind of this interesting variation between whether the code used the word we and you versus like company and employees. So it's kind of more formal. The company does that. Employees are expected to do that, and we versus you. And this we thought to be an interesting example to examine what is the effect of this choice of language on people's behavior. So there's also kind of coming up from the actual codes and a lot of literature suggesting that there might be a difference here. It's a group identity, a trust, intrinsic versus extrinsic motivation, and professionalism. So kind of company and employees is a more professional terminology. The design is basically a lab studies and online experiments, then a short-term panel study, so repeated measures over time. And then we just recently got a field research that actually also supports our findings. The DV we use in most of the studies is basically where the people misrepresented their own performance. It's kind of a cheating experiment. Just an example. So basically, in each of these studies, we gave people, they had assignments, they come to a group, they have to do stuff, and then this is like a we. So we always emphasize the we versus you, and in other codes, we use more kind of the more formal language. In the first study, this is an MTurk, 3 condition with a control group, and then people need to solve metrics. Some of them are not solvable, and what we see is that in the we condition, people cheat more, okay, relative to both the control group and the more formal language. The second study is done on Odesk. So this is where we get people for 3 weeks, and basically we can see the effect over time. And again, people do all kind of assignment during those 3 weeks, and we come up and measure every time how they report their own performance. And what we see here also is that the same thing replicates. So in a sense that the we code people cheat more, they over report their performance. Same thing in the following week. And then we also did a lab experiment. There was actually Mariam was doing it in Northwestern, where she got people, the subject, to come into a lab, and actually the same results. Again, the we code people cheated more. Recently, this is really preliminary, we got from the S&P 500 all the codes and all the reported misconducts over a period of 20 years. And the same thing also seems to be coming from that data. So when the codes had more of kind of the language of you and we, there were more reported misconducts. But this is really preliminary in a sense. It's someone analyzing its own data in our request, which kind of, I think to summarize, language choices seems to be important. We're still short on the mechanism side, so we did few mediation analysis who were not conclusive, but we think that this notion of the language trade-off, so you choose different words and you get different outcomes, seems to be a promising research direction. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Andromachi Athanasopoulou. I'm a residential fellow this year. I'm also an associate fellow at the University of Oxford. So the institution I'm interested in studying are business schools, and I'm particularly interested in contributing to the discussion with regards to the role of business schools in nurturing ethical leadership. So I specifically wanted to explore whether there are differences in the way business school academics and business people cope with moral dilemmas at work context, and then reflect on whether institutional corruption in business can be partly attributed to these potential mismatches between these two groups, and whether that signals areas where business schools' ethical leadership development training can be improved. So I conducted qualitative interviews with individuals from both groups. The interviews consisted of three sections, three parts. The first one was open-ended questions around what are moral dilemmas at work context. And then a second phase was I gave them several moral dilemma scenarios and asked them to see how they would respond to these dilemmas. And then I used the photo elicitation method as the last part of the data collection, where I asked individuals, the participants, to select images that represent their feelings when they're facing a moral dilemma at work, and try to discuss around this selection during the interviews. So the key findings: managers are more likely to define a moral dilemma as a tension or a conflict, whereas business school academics are more likely to take a stewardship approach and describe moral dilemmas as something that relates to whose interests they need to serve and how they select on that basis. So the four scenarios I've used in the as the second stage of the data collection, where the first one was I was asking them to choose between, in a fictional moral dilemma scenario, where they would have to choose between laying off 20,000 employees or taking a high-risk decision to diversify their company products. A second one where I would ask them whether they would accept a bribe in order to fund a charity. The third one was whether they were willing to gain access to a highly lucrative market with having the first mover advantage compared to their competitors, but by risking their employees' safety. And the fourth scenario was from the academic context, and I was asking them whether they could imagine, and some of them, they were associate professors about to get tenure, and they had to grade the exam that was sat by the dean's daughter, and she got a marginal fail, and whether they would change the mark if in exchange of dean support to get their tenure. The key findings are that academics are more likely to consider the presented scenarios not as moral dilemmas, but rather as transactional decisions or operational or strategic decisions. On the other hand, managers were more likely to suggest to focus on the moral aspect of the decision. Academics are more likely to choose riskier options as solutions to these different dilemmas. And there was more consistency among the responses of the managers compared to academics. So I found large variations depending on whether a business school professor was in finance and economics compared to marketing or organizational behavior. So the second, the last part was the photo elicitation method. If you are curious how an academic feels when they face a moral dilemma and how a manager feels, that's like what two of my participants selected. So I wanted to see whether, from the images that they brought, how they felt about the situation within which they face a moral dilemma, what images related to the action of having to make a decision, how they thought about these dilemmas, and how they felt. So just a teaser of some of the images and the represented feelings with regards to moral dilemmas are these. So they feel angst, fear, stress. They talked about feeling repressed, feeling powerless. Quite a few described about an immediate feeling of wanting to escape from the situation, to reflect, to protect themselves. And finally, quite a few referred to how they want to feel once they've taking that decision, feeling that peace of having made the right decision. That's it. Thank you.
What do I just hit that? To go ahead. What? Back and front. Well, thank you. My name is Young Dal. I'm a senior fellow at the Initiative for Responsible Investment. And I came to institutional corruption and was a network fellow for a couple of years because it spoke to an issue that I was struggling with. And that is that I, as a lawyer and as a participant, advise blue-collar, pink-collar, and white-collar workers who sit as trustees on big pension funds. And they have a terrible position. They're part of a system that's financialized our society, leading to inequality and et cetera. And so I've been working to do some things about it. We know we can't do much with the big banks. We know that the corruption there is so strong and the regulatory capture is so strong. And we saw an ad, or we saw a newspaper article in one of the presentations this morning about Deutsche Bank pays $2.5 billion for cheating on LIBOR. We just saw something last week where the big banks are paying billions of dollars for cheating on foreign exchange. So an individual trustee, even on a very large pension fund, can't do anything about that. But isn't there a way that we could be protected? And so I started focusing on a group called Investment Consultants, and that's what my project was. I wrote a paper for the Safra Center that got a fair amount of currency around the world. I got a ferocious pushback. We had a meeting here at the Responsible Investment where I was threatened by some of the investment consultants, but it obviously had some kind of effect. So it's important because investment consultants are people in the chain for retirement. So how many of y'all have some kind of private retirement, an IRA or something like that? And how many of you use some kind of consultant, Merrill Lynch, Vanguard, somebody like that? All right. So most of us are involved in this system as well. We're switching from a defined benefit system to a defined contribution system, unfortunately, and we're entering a period where we're going to be in a retirement crisis. It's fairly clear. So the system itself is important and the integrity is important. How do we restore trust, and what role do investment consultants play? Now this is, I'll go this quickly, but this is the typical structure on a big pension fund, and you'll see that the investment consultants are part of the chain between the trustees and the actual place where the money is invested. What do they do exactly? They provide advice, manage services on abstract level. They predict the future. There's a great cartoon in the New Yorker this week about some rich people sitting around drinking wine and say, I can smell that the Federal Reserve is going to do this next month or something like that. They talk about asset allocation. They think they can divine the economic politics and financial market future. They're subject to the regular kind of quid pro quo corruption. There's no doubt about it. There's all kinds of payments that go on from consultants to managers and back, conference fees, and I talk about some of the ways that it's done. Bundling goes on. And then they give a kind of a structure of perks to trustees through so-called educational conferences or due diligence trips to China or to Cuba or to wherever that are really well-paid junkets. But there's some unique factors, and that was one of the more interesting things here, that I think really lay into the issue of institutional corruption. And that is, this is an industry that invented itself in basically the late 70s. And so they invented what their industry does. And they put a giant amount of complexity that is completely unneeded. There's informational asymmetries, which are unneeded. There's an extraordinary amount of uncertainty that they play on. And one of the most clever ways is that they go to, some of them individually, go to the trustees and say, you know these big banks are sharks, so you need a shark to help you run with the sharks, and that's what I can do for you. So since I wrote the paper, there was a fairly major paper from the Oxford Business School that looked at what the effect was of of investment consultants and how successful their advice was. Turns out the funds that used them in a big way made less money than the ones who did not. And I think that Larry's quote here is a very good thing, because the individual investment consultants are not bad folks, but they end up doing bad things, and that's why I like to see all the psychology and things that we have in this program. And the last thing I'll say is this: is with the help of Bill English and Carla Miller and Mark Somos, we, while I was here, I went to talk to the CFA Institute, which trains a lot of the investment consultants to try to get them to put institutional corruption in their curricula. We did all kinds of stuff. We said we would do it, we would pay for it. The final analysis, they decided they wouldn't do it. And because I believe it's a system that the people inside the system are doing quite well with, and they really don't want to change. So thank you very much.
Hi, my name's Elizabeth Gilbert. I am a lawyer turned social psychology graduate student. And I'm going to talk about some of my work with Liz Tenney, who's a SAFRA Center Network Fellow, and our colleagues, about perceptions of responsibility and blameworthiness. So legally, responsibility is generally based on two separate elements. One is actus reus, or whether a person actually caused some bad outcome, right? Did I shoot the guy who is now dead? The other element is mens rea, so that's your mental state. Did I know that I was shooting that guy when I pulled the trigger? Or was it an accident? But do people really keep these elements separate? It seems they don't. Now, that our actions might influence our perceived mental states might not be super surprising, right? If I slowly, repeatedly stab you, that's pretty good evidence that I know what I'm doing and I intend to harm you. But what might be more interesting is that the reverse also seems to be true. So if you know that I intend to harm, that might make you judge me as being more causal of bad things, even if my behavior is exactly the same as somebody else who didn't intend to harm. But previous research has generally been limited to immoral actors and actors who had bad intentions, or at least who were perceived as having bad intentions. So the current project looks at people who don't have bad intentions and are not necessarily immoral, and they just have some knowledge relevant to a bad outcome. So in our first study, we just used a vignette about a woman who was mowing her lawn. And as she's mowing, her lawnmower starts to shake, and she looks back, and her tulips have been destroyed. So not bad intent, not immoral. The one thing we vary is whether or not she knew in advance that her lawnmower was prone to malfunction. And what we find is that when she had knowledge, she's considered more the main cause of the destruction of the tulips. We've also repeated this with some other vignettes, car accidents and more legal things. And we consistently find that people who have knowledge are rated as more causal of these bad outcomes. So the question is why? If it doesn't have to do with intent or immorality, what's going on? And we hypothesize that it might have to do with counterfactual thinking, which is common and spontaneous after bad outcomes. So if, let's say, you missed your flight to the conference today, you might think, ugh, if only I had left 30 minutes earlier, or if only there hadn't been that traffic jam on the way. And in particular, we think that knowledge might lead other people to generate counterfactuals that are particularly potent and controllable. So using that same vignette, we just asked participants in a follow-up study to list up to 4 ways that the tulips could have been basically preserved, right? And then we asked them to rate their counterfactuals for how potent they are. So that's how likely is it that this actually could happen, and if it did happen, how likely is it that that counterfactual would have actually made a difference? And also for how much the actor could have controlled it, right? So something like, if only Julia had been more careful, it's probably pretty potent and pretty controllable. But we had one participant who wrote, if only Martians had come down and saved the day. Probably neither potent nor controllable. Maybe potent, but not up to Julia's control. And again, we replicate this finding that when the actor has knowledge, she's considered more causal of the bad outcome. And interestingly, when she has knowledge, people also generate counterfactuals that she had more control over. And generating those counterfactuals in turn predicts causality. So when we run a mediation analysis, it's consistent with the model that knowledge is increasing causation because it increases the types of counterfactuals. So people are generating counterfactuals that that knowledgeable person could control. So in conclusion, it seems that knowledge can increase judgments about causation and blame. And people might expect knowledgeable institutions or leaders to do things to prevent bad outcomes, even when they don't have a legal obligation to do so, even when they don't have bad intent, they aren't particularly immoral, and sometimes even when their direct causal relation to the outcome isn't very clear. And I think this has interesting ramifications for whether people view the law as legitimate and reason in ways consistent with the law. And it also has ramifications for when we might lose trust in our institutions or leaders when they don't do things that we think they should do, regardless of whether they have a legal responsibility to do those things or not. Thank you.
I'm Catherine Anderson. I'm a choreographer, anti-corruption activist, and a 2014-15 EJ Safra Fellow. My project's objective was to design creative community engagement tools to address institutional corruption within American legislative bodies. The principles of community organizing, summarized nicely by this Peter Dreyer quote, informed my project's values. I tried to always think about the citizen as the subject, not the object of a given campaign. Here we have the citizen as object approach on the left. You know these guys, the street fundraisers, or less flatteringly, the charity muggers. The message here is that your role as a citizen is a passive one. Sign the petition and donate money so that we, the organization, can keep doing this important work. While this practice must be a valuable tool for some nonprofit models, it contradicts my project's primary objective, to build participation and leadership within the community itself. So then what does the citizen as subject approach look like? Well, in designing my tools, I thought about three key elements. The first, the information element. Does this experience offer the right amount of the most important information? Second is the action element. Am I providing concrete, immediate opportunities for meaningful participation? And finally, the art element. Are people creatively engaged in problem solving, art making, etc.? Are people connecting to the featured artistic content? Briefly, a note about the context. All of my strategies were designed for Represent Boston's volunteer-run campaign in Cambridge to pass an anti-corruption bill called the Cambridge Voter Access Act. For those who don't know, Represent Boston is a local chapter of the anti-corruption organization Represent Us. And now the tools themselves. My first tool is Sidewalk Movement. It's a dance theater installation performed in a public space, in this case, Porter Square subway station. The sound score featured recorded interviews with actual Cambridge residents, and here is a 90-second clip from performance on April 17th.
Yes, I am a Cambridge.
Trust, an interesting word. Do I trust the elected?
I think that donations definitely cause conflict.
Cambridge is progressive, so I mean, you know, I think that our citizens specifically in Cambridge are a little more involved.
Well, the 50-50
runs for Cambridge City Council seat. Says she'll run without taking voters' dollars.
What the developers want them to do regarding zoning instead of what actual residents we don't get to know housing.
We just see the ads.
Fellow citizens of Massachusetts, we still need to reform the way money affects our elections. To that work, we must now all turn.
One of the first things we learn as citizens of our culture is the principle of reciprocation. If you do me a favor, I owe you a favor. And what I learned is that very simply, people say yes to those they owe. Every member of every human culture has been trained to play by this rule. You must not take without giving in return.
Second tool is the Citizens Think Tank. My objective here was to humanize the petition process. We set up the Citizens Think Tank in various community spaces, including the Cambridge Farmers Market, which is pictured here. Each participant illustrates the outline of a speaker symbol with his or her self-portrait and writes an idea for Cambridge in the speech bubble. And on the back, the resident can endorse the Cambridge Voter Access Act and address the postcard to a particular Cambridge City Councilor. And here are some examples of some of the postcards we got. We had some earnest responses. A lot of people talked about affordable housing, Alamo Draft House, and this lovely abstract piece in pink marker. The postcards will be presented at a Represent Boston event this spring. And finally, the Doc and Talk film and discussion series. I chose films that demonstrated how progress on issues popular in Cambridge, like the environment, affordable housing, food justice, how progress on those issues could be stymied by institutional corruption at the federal level and also at the municipal level, which is where we are working in Cambridge. And each screening is followed by an audience-based discussion. Finally, I'd like to give thanks to everybody who helped with my project, and thank you all.